Welcome to Rethinking Humanitarianism, a show that explores the future of aid in a world of rising crises. I'm your host, Nour ElAssy, CEO of the New Humanitarian. World powers are fighting over the future of Gaza, the stage of the battle, the UN Security Council. In October, Hamas and Israel agreed to a peace plan, brokered in part by US President Donald Trump. Never mind that Israel has killed or injured hundreds of Palestinians since the so-called ceasefire began. Now the Security Council has passed a resolution backing the so-called 20-point plan. It authorizes an international stabilisation force and approves a board of peace overseen by Trump. Essentially, this would govern Gaza and oversee reconstruction and humanitarian aid. There are red flags all over this, not to mention an absence of voices from Palestine and from Gaza. So, on today's episode, we'll look at the implications from three different perspectives. We first hear from Shahd Hammouri, a Palestinian-Jordanian lecturer in international law who sees that the plan has alarming parallels. The occupation of Iraq.
The overall narrative here is the US using international legal mechanisms to normalize an unlawful occupation and to leave its forces without any international oversight.
Then we'll hear from Gazan poet and writer Nour ElAssy about why the war in Gaza has not ended, despite all the rhetoric about peace, through reading of a personal essay of hers on the New Humanitarian.
Gaza is the spectacle. The West Bank is the bureaucracy. One system, two tempos, one colonizer. You cannot separate bombardment from annexation and pretend to discuss security.
Finally, we'll speak to journalist Riley Sparks for new reporting on humanitarian aid in Gaza.
You have aid agencies, Palestinians in Gaza, all the sort of principled actors saying one thing, and then you have the Israeli government saying something that's completely different, that bears no resemblance to reality at all.
A note, these interviews were recorded just before the UN Security Council vote on 17 November. If you have any questions or comments, stick around for the credits to learn how to reach us here at Rethinking Humanitarianism. We're here to talk about the ceasefire in Gaza and about the political efforts in the Security Council and the possible so-called stabilization force that is being planned. But before we go there, tell me about the ceasefire.
Well, in Palestine, we say "you cease, I fire" is what this is called. At the moment, over 200 people have been killed since the ceasefire has been announced. Israeli forces are still in more than half of the Gaza Strip, and they're still also controlling humanitarian aid. Most of the most important medicines are not coming in, and we have noticed that the food that is coming into Gaza is of the poorest quality possible. So instead of allowing fresh vegetables and meat to come in, they're allowing sugary snacks and canned foods to come in. So, of course, this is a ceasefire that was reached almost a month ago, and it came within the larger Trump 20-point plan as he seeks to establish for himself this historic win, so to speak. It was agreed upon by the military factions. Nevertheless, after the different steps of it remain quite vague, as in what happens after the ceasefire in relation to the governance of Gaza, as well as the militarization of the military factions in it.
So the United States is seeking apparently a United Nations Security Council mandate. And in my understanding, a lot of the countries that were supposed or are expected to join the so-called stabilization force are waiting for a mandate of that sort. They don't want to go on their own account or at the promises of the United States. So we expect a Security Council resolution on this. What's your information about that, and what do you expect or have a precaution about in terms of the Security Council resolution?
So if I may simply describe how the resolution looks like based on the information that we have so far and the draft that has been given by the US. First of all, the US is proposing this resolution that endorses the Trump 20-point plan and establishes a so-called board of peace. Those who are on the board of peace include the US as well as a number of other states, all of whom have breached their duties vis-a-vis the Palestinian people and haven't abided by their international legal obligations. The United States of America itself being complicit in this genocide, if not a direct participant in the genocide. So to create a board of peace by the people who have killed those same people seems like a joke. So they are proposing that this board of peace be given an international legal personality and also be in coordination with the illegal occupier of Palestine, and that is Israel. Under this board of peace, they are seeking to create a civil body to oversee the day-to-day operations in Palestine. Now this is being referred to as the CMSCC, and there is a lot of discussion among investors as well as other states around it, as you would see from the coverage of, for example, Politico. This body will oversee everything, including immigration, reconstruction, humanitarian efforts, and public services. What we've seen so far is that within its structure, it really reminds us of the same mechanisms that put the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, that is responsible for the killing of over 2,000 Palestinians and has given us the symbol of flour mixed in with blood. And the civil body is seeking to engage with Palestinian so-called technocrats. And those are more or less elite Palestinians who have been chosen to be worthy of the trust of those nations. The civil body is really reminiscent of the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq. It is one that seeks to oversee everything around this. And furthermore, it will build also on reconstruction premised on loans from the World Bank, thereby putting the Palestinians, instead of them getting reparations as per international law, what they will be getting is debt bondage. Last but not least is the International Stabilisation Force, in collaboration with both Egypt and Israel. And this stabilization force seeks to also work and organize a police that is formed from a local trusted people. What we've heard so far also is that Abu Shabab, who is a notorious war criminal in Gaza and who has collaborated with Israel in committing a good part of its war crimes internally and has caused a lot of fracture among the Palestinians, is the person that Kushner is meeting to lead this so-called police force. This stabilization force will get to decide who is a terrorist and who is not, who will get food and who will not. So, in effect, what this resolution will do is to normalize a completely illegal situation. Israel is an illegal occupier in Palestine as per the International Court of Justice's decision, and UNRWA is the humanitarian body that ought to be in charge of the humanitarian discourse in Gaza. None of this is mentioned, none of the crimes are mentioned, and furthermore, under international law, an occupation is controlled by a hostile army, and it lacks completely, in this case, Palestinian representation or Palestinian consent. And even if we are to say that Hamas accepted the peace plan, Hamas is an armed militia. It gets to accept things in relation to its armed discourse. It doesn't get to accept things in relation to the Palestinian right of self-determination.
Exactly. So this will have consequences on any political long-term solutions. So Palestinians are being put in a place where they have no voice now and in consequence, no voice in the future.
Not at all. And not only that, their consent here is diluted by the claim that, one, either Hamas accepted this or if the Palestinian Authority accept this at the UN level. However, in both cases, there is a very important element that people seem to be forgetting, which is coercion. Israel and the United States of America have clearly made the options. Either you accept our plan or, quote unquote, we finish the job. Finishing the job is finishing the genocide.
As a legal scholar, if this is approved by the Security Council, does it make it legal, even if it doesn't have a legal status or a legal basis in international law? Does occupation become legal if it's approved by the Security Council?
That is a question that lies at the heart of the contradictions of this system, because everything that the US is proposing is blatantly illegal. Like, you cannot come and enforce a foreign body and a foreign military of organization on a people who blatantly say no. Every single person in Gaza, if asked about their answer, except of course for Abu Shabab's militias, would say blatantly, absolutely no. We are enough humans to run ourselves. And the right of self-determination is a jus cogens norm. It's a preemptory norm of international law. Endless amount of international court of justice decisions on this. So when the UN Security Council acts in complete violation and overlooking basic premises of international legal order, we create a core contradiction in the system that almost is, and this is what I've heard from some diplomats, what the US is trying to do here is really touching at the core of the system. However, it's not the first time the US does this. It did this with Iraq, and that is the complete politicization of this legal system, and where it sought to normalize an illegal occupation of Iraq through UN Security Council mechanisms. So will this mean that the occupation, and in this case, it would mean that the US would become the direct occupier of Gaza? Would this make it legal? Well, that would open up a can of worms for international lawyers to feed on. And that is simply the dismay and the destruction of the whole international legal system. Some would tell you the superiority of the UN Security Council, and those are the people who uphold what we call a rules-based order. To them, this contradiction doesn't matter because the status quo is what matters. Others who uphold public international law as we know it would tell you that the contradiction is too heavy to bear and we should still maintain those rules. In conclusion, what I would say is A does not negate B. No one could come and say that the Palestinians' right to rule themselves by themselves is now negated or that that coercion has been normalized. It would just simply trigger a crisis that will really feed into generations going forward within the whole of the discipline, rendering it a complete mockery.
Which is effectively takes us to Iraq, but also takes us 100 years back. I mean, I come from Syria, and Syria was put under a mandate, quote unquote, of an occupying power. So was Palestine as well at the time by the legal body of the time, the League of Nations. So it is not a new thing where occupation is justified by the existing system and by the desire, as you say, to sustain the status quo. Is that Board for Peace, is it the one that will have Tony Blair?
I believe so. And it's hilarious because this feels like such a bad Disney remake of the same Iraq story. And it's such a bad director that they even, didn't bother to change the character because, Tony Blair has been such a great asset to humanity that we needed to revive his legacy in a context of genocide.
There was an interview on a British channel and they asked why Tony Blair, and a brilliant woman says, well, maybe the devil was occupied. But that takes us back to Iraq. So I landed in Iraq on my first international work with the Red Cross at the time in June of 2003, about 3 weeks after the fall of Baghdad. And it was supposedly going to be, as the Americans were promised, that they will be received as heroes. This wasn't the case. And soon enough, things went to the hell that Iraq was for the next, well, still now. The studies, even by 2005 and 6, were talking about the excess mortality of 1 million Iraqis. And Tony Blair was one of those and never suffered the consequences. So was, at the time, Paul Bremer, if anyone remembers the name, who was the governor of Iraq by the Americans and who invented the de-Baathification, as he called it, and led directly to the disaffected army officers becoming the seeds of Al-Qaeda in Iraq and then ISIS later. All of them were trained and got connected in the military prisons of the Americans and the British in Iraq. So we forget all that. We act as if what is happening now never happened before. You talk about those parallels with Iraq, which not a common comparison. Can you tell me more about that?
The US, first of all, used the Security Council more or less to normalize its administration of Iraq under the premises of quote-unquote reconstruction of Iraq. Also, Burma himself facilitated a good amount of, let's say, the untangling of everything that was there through the de-Baathification process. Here, what we are seeing, the US has created the recipe of the self-determination forces that is packaged in peace and security. And it's reusing that packaging here in the sense of, one, this is direct control by the US over Palestinian territories. It is creating a board of peace where it gets to say who's in and who's out. Two, it is collaborating with local technocrats, the same that it did in Iraq, in the fact that it coming in to call itself a savior while creating a political space that only fits the elite and those who collaborate with it, and using the locals against themselves. Third, what we are seeing here is going to be a hyper use of a military force as well as police force in order to ensure that there is no dissent at a whatsoever level. What we can anticipate going forward is that instead of Israel using Gaza as an opportunity to market its weapons, now it's going to use it as an opportunity to market surveillance capacity as well, and offering it a new revival for its market. We can imagine going forward, as Sydney Tyam and other prisons have already shown us and already starting to show us, how without any oversight, soldiers will do the wars to the people under their control, as we saw now from testimonies of gang rape in Palestinian prisons, as well as the torture and whatnot. We are looking at another Abu Ghraib, and we already have the bits and pieces of Abu Ghraib. So let's say the overall narrative here is the US using international legal mechanisms to normalize an unlawful occupation and to leave its forces without any international oversight.
Who do you anticipate to be on the stabilization force? What countries will send soldiers there?
So far, we know of Indonesia, Pakistan, as well as the US has said that it will send 200 officers, but they will not directly engage on the ground. We also anticipate the use of private military contractors. Also, this plan is not going forward without the support of Gulf states. And what we understand is that Gulf states are behind this plan. So we anticipate some funding from Gulf states that while they are not directly there on the ground, they can hire people to be there on the ground. And we've seen also hesitation from other states that were approached to participate in this stabilization force. Turkey has also suggested that it would participate. However, Israel has vetoed that.
Yes.
According to the whole structure, at all points, Israel has veto power. And according to one of the leaked PowerPoints that the US has put in relation to the force, that's the CMSCC, which is now being marketed as a company that everyone wants a share of, the Palestinian Authority might have a say, but not on equal grounds as the Israeli forces.
So to sum up where we are now, there's a plan by the US that has aided and abetted the genocide for the 2 years, that Israel has veto on every part of, that is supported by states that in Francesca Albanese's report, almost all of them are complicit in the genocide to start with, and has no voice of Palestinian people, will have armies of several countries, and will be dressed up. So that's the lipstick on the pig, with a Security Council resolution and surveillance and continuation of the occupation and no self-determination. What do you expect the mid to slightly longer term outcomes to be of what is happening?
So to begin with, in relation to the silence, and we've noticed this quite a lot, there are a few American outlets that are sharing a little bit of information about this. However, the core of the plan seems to be something that just everyone is accepting. And our understanding is that the amount of political pressure and coercion that is going into normalizing that plan is quite immense, as well as the amount of money being poured into it. Sadly enough, the complicity of Gulf states is making this way much worse, as well as the complicity of the Palestinian Authority. I myself have had a lot of problems trying to just simply speak even a little bit or try to sound the red alert of the fact that this is a renewed occupation that is far too dangerous, that everyone who's gone to the streets in the past 2 years asking for a free Palestine will face a complete roadblock, because now anything that we try to say, we will have the answer of, yes, but this is mandated by the UN Security Council. This is even a larger problem for international lawyers. So I have no idea how international lawyers are not freaking out that their whole discipline is being made into an absolute mockery. If it goes ahead, this means that what we will find is in Gaza at the moment. First of all, mass privatization of everything, selling off of Palestinian lands, and we will find the police forces coming in. People will be detained in mass numbers again. There will still be the killing of, 10 Palestinians per day as per the acceptable, not to make it enough to the BBC or the Guardian or the CNN. So it's a low-paced genocide. But also what will happen is Jared Kushner will get his privatized Riviera. It will be too expensive for Palestinians to ever think about affording, or that's their current dream. And Palestinians will be offered small housing only to those who have proven themselves not to show any sign of agency. And the problem is a lot of people are speaking about Gaza as if they know it. Like in Gaza, there isn't like a clear, these are Hamas or not. Anyone who says no to occupation for Israel is considered to be a terrorist. So any person with dignity who says no is therefore legitimately either killed or detained. And those who are willing to have their will broken, and believe me, the people of Gaza are really, really, really dignified in their struggle and would refuse to. This would mean a lot of struggle internally. And then they would be taken down by debt and pushed into low-wage labor until they are forced to engage with that system. Their will be taken from them bit by bit, as normalized through institution and bureaucracy and heavy policing and militarization. I know this sounds like it comes from a film, a dystopian one, but indeed it says that the US will take control until 2027. In 2 years' time, you are able to do a lot in a place. You're able to establish the infrastructure of a neoliberalized open economy where people aren't only coerced through the use of weapons, but also through the use of money and the economy. And imagine for people who've just come out of a genocide. Perhaps the dehumanization of Palestinians is something that we just never overcame. Even after 2 years of genocide, people still cannot see the danger when it's in our face. And all states are willing to negotiate this. You could see this in the media. You could see this in the main narratives of states. And it's indeed beyond crazy.
What should humanitarian aid organizations who welcome the ceasefire, and I understand that no one wants the industrial scale killing to continue day on day, what is their next step? What would they be doing now to fulfill their function, which is to deliver aid as well as they can, but also to not do harm by normalizing the continuation of this low-burn genocide that you've mentioned? What should we ask them to do?
For everyone working in good consciousness in this field, and I presume people who enter this field enter with the purpose and with the need to uphold those standards of treating everyone equally. One of the main problems that we have with humanitarian work is that we zoom in rather than zoom out. And this is a context where I would say that dignified humanitarian work requires talking about something that we usually don't talk about, which is self-determination. Humanitarian organizations need to condition their engagement as well as push in their advocacy. We all know that humanitarian organizations have a sound and they are well respected also among a lot of parliamentary representatives, diplomatic representatives. And by speaking out against the stabilization force, by speaking out against this plan and seeking to unify a position where the humanitarian organizations refuse to engage and act, and with this context, in a situation that constitutes a direct violation of self-determination. Otherwise, what we are doing, and here there's been a lot of critique, for example, for the position of the ICRC in this case, is just normalizing a very illegal situation. And I agree that there is a level of pragmatism that is needed, but COGAT and Israel are not really in a position to answer a unified space that says that we must uphold international law. And if we allow international law to be completely mocked in this case, what are we to say about the future? Where are we to look at when it comes to other places? Especially now that the whole world is changing. Would we have allowed ourselves to uphold such a low standard if this was France that we are speaking about? Or if this was Canada? Or if these were Canadian people that we are engaging with? Would we have said that, yes, it's absolutely fine to shake hands with their occupiers and allow a plan that mass subjugates those people? Or do we actually note that in order to undertake our work, we need to uphold this very simple doctrine that is at the core of the system. We need to expand our understanding beyond the rules of IHL into the rules of self-determination. And let's be very clear, the main reason that the lens of humanitarian organizations is this narrow is not because it's the demand of justice, but it's the demand of politics across time and across history. And we need to keep that very clear. And there's a very thin line when we are normalizing domination and when we are supporting those who are under it to conceive of their dignity and self-determination. And we need to understand that our approach must be holistic to that sense, and also a unified position is one that is most important. Perhaps people have become too comfortable in their chairs in a commercialized comprehension of what humanitarianism would do, only if it aligns with what states and dominating powers would let us do. And we are in front, really, an existential crisis that should be, and everyone should be asking themselves, what are the values that I want to uphold? Why did I enter this field? And the more we have people who are asking these questions, the more we are likely to form a unified opinion that upholds something very basic, lessons from humanity that came from colonization, that really, if we are unable to see them, we will really pave a way for a much darker future.
Thank you very much, Shahd. This was a privilege. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tamam.
And now we hear a personal essay by Gazan poet and writer Nour ElAssy. For the last year, she's been sharing her words with the New Humanitarian. In her latest essay, she talks about the ceasefire and the illusion of stability.
The war in Gaza didn't end, it only changed tempo. The thunder of bombs has given way to the hiss of drones. A random gunfire at checkpoints and the silence of hospitals that no longer heal. The words of the ceasefire that was announced with fanfare last month have fallen on Gaza like dust, coating the tongue and choking the air. It may have paused some of the airstrikes, but it did not end the occupation. In exile in Paris, I wake to the same messages each morning from my family in Gaza. Don't be afraid, ya mama, we are alive. But at night, I still feel terrified and leave my mother, younger sister, and friends' voice notes filled with tears. Their messages to me are not about hope or progress, but survival. It feels like the air is holding its breath, my eldest sister texted last night from northern Gaza. We cannot trust quiet anymore. In Gaza, calm is prelude to destruction. The ceasefire that entered into effect on October 10th, broked by the United States, Egypt, and Qatar, was supposed to end 2 years of annihilation, but it has not ended the hunger, displacement, or fear. Israel has continued to shell and shot people in Gaza, violating the truth over 100 times, killing more than 240 and injuring over 600. Israel is still demolishing buildings and homes in mass. And entire neighborhoods such as Shuja'iyya, where my home is, and Jabalia are still inaccessible. They call it a ceasefire. My cousin Islam, a nurse at Shahd al-Aqsa hospital in Deir al-Balah, told me. But the hospitals are graves. We have patients whose conditions are still deteriorating towards death rather than healing. A lot of times they die quietly because the generator cuts out or because there are not enough doctors or space. We have no fuel to let them live. My friend and family tell me that food is now more available than it was during the worst period of starvation over the summer. But affordability is a new siege of its own. Israel is allowing commercial trucks into Gaza but continuing to restrict aid conveys. Most people have no money to buy goods, and prices of essential items are still higher than they were before the war, and even than during the previous ceasefire earlier this year. Bread is still scarce. flour is rationed, and lentils and rice arrive in markets that most cannot reach. My mother told me that a kilo of tomatoes now costs more than a family's entire daily wage, and most families don't even have a source of income. We buy half a portion and we call it enough, she said. That's the situation for those who still have access to money. The unemployment rate has been around 800% or higher for more than a year. People have to use informal brokers who charge commission fees over 200% to withdraw money from their bank accounts. During the many months of displacement, entire life savings has been spent on tents, blankets, and water that's sold by the liter. Even if you have money, you don't really have it, my friend Miriam said. A ceasefire that does not address the utter economic devastation in Gaza is just an illusion of stability. Israel's laying waste to the enclave has caused an estimated $70 billion in damages. The UN estimated that 8,100% of all buildings in Gaza have sustained damage. Of those, 6,100% are totally destroyed. Around 8,600 of cropland has been damaged. The healthcare system is in tatters. Almost 1.5 million people, 7,100% of the population, are in need of emergency shelter. Over 9,100% of schools need either to be entirely rebuilt or to undergo major rehabilitation to be functional. Even if the guns actually fell silent today, the truth is, Gaza is uninhabitable. The only way people can survive is by being put on life support by the international community, and even that is being blocked. Families who have returned to the north are still living in the debris where their homes once stood. The walls that are still partially standing are burned black as coal. People inhale the debris of destruction day and night. Return has become a pilgrimage to absence. Families walk north, retracing streets that no longer exist. A father bends to lift a photograph buried in concrete. A child asks why the streets are so gray. Beyond Gaza, the West Bank disintegrates more quietly. In the past weeks, Israeli settlers have attacked Palestinians trying to harvest olives from their land, burned people's homes to the ground, and attacked Palestinians' livestock. More trees have been damaged and more communities affected this year than in the previous 6 years, Tom Fletcher, the UN's top humanitarian official, said. All of this is done with total impunity and even support from the Israeli government. When Gaza burns, they take our health, my friend Mu'taz, a student in Paris with me from Hebron in the southern West Bank, said. And when Gaza stops burning, they say it's peace. Somehow not everyone has lost hope. My former colleague and friend Ismail Abu Daya, who is still documenting daily life in the Strip, told me, the ceasefire means I can send you photos again. It means one more day of breath. Maybe that's enough for now. Hope here is an act of resistance. To rebuild a tent, to plant mint in broken soil, to teach a child the alphabet under a plastic roof. All of it is defiance, yet despair stalks every conversation. We are afraid to rest, my mother said. Every time we start to breathe, they start again. A real ceasefire would mean open crossing for aid, fuel, and people monitored by international observers with real enforcement power. The release of all Palestinian detainees held without charge, including medical personnel and journalists, and a freeze and reversal of settlement expansion in the West Bank. It would mean the prosecution of settler violence, restoration of farmers' access to land, reconstruction of water, power, and healthcare systems, not as charity but as obligation under international law, economic reconstruction, the stabilisation of Gaza's banking system, and the breaking of the Black Martin Commission syndicates the steel survivor from the war. Anything less than this, it's not a ceasefire. It is a pause in the bombing under continued domination. Gaza is the spectacle. The West Bank is the bureaucracy. one system, two tempos, one colonizer. You cannot separate bombardment from annexation and pretend to discuss security. The ceasefire vagueness is deliberate. It is how domination renews itself without noise. We refuse the language that launders its reality. We refuse to celebrate a silence that smells of smoke. The ceasefire has kept us breathing, it has not made us free. Freedom, not a pause between violent raids, not a quota of air trucks, not the right to rebuild ruins again, is the only end to this story that deserves the word peace.
And now we hear from TNH reporter Riley Sparks looking at the humanitarian aid situation in Gaza. Riley, thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you so much. It's really nice to be here.
You've been following up on the situation of aid in Gaza for the past period. And since the last ceasefire this past October, it looks like there is some cessation of hostilities, although this is not complete. But what we're not hearing as much about is the situation of delivery of humanitarian aid to Gaza. You've been following this up. Can you tell me what you have seen and heard?
Certainly the hope with the ceasefire was that aid agencies would be able to dramatically increase the amount of goods and services that they were able to deliver to Gaza, which, over the past 2 years has been nearly impossible as a result of Israeli imposed restrictions. That has largely not been the case. I think what we have seen is a continuation of many of the same restrictions that were in place over the past 2 years and even prior to that imposed by Israeli authorities. And as you pointed out, we also haven't seen a stop in the fighting. I mean, Israeli forces continue to attack people in Gaza, leaving hundreds of casualties over the last month. So the short answer is that the ceasefire has decreased the number of attacks. It hasn't stopped them. It has marginally increased the amount of aid that can be delivered to Gaza. But again, it hasn't delivered the kind of dramatic scale up that people were hoping for. And, with winter coming up, I mean, I'm sure people will have seen the pictures of the flooding that's now hitting Gaza. I mean, talking about people who have spent the past 2 years displaced in tents or in, the ruins of their former homes. I mean, the images are just absolutely appalling. And certainly the fact that Israeli forces are not allowing even a bare minimum of shelter stuff into Gaza speaks to the fact that these restrictions have not been lifted, certainly in the way that you would expect.
So if we were to go back to early October and think about what we heard about the Trump peace plan, which is now being accelerated into potentially a vote in the Security Council as of the recording of this, we would have thought that there'd be a cessation of hostilities, a ceasefire, a massive flow of aid, and a retraction of the Israeli forces out of Gaza, as well as the exchange of hostages on both sides. Some of that has happened. As you mentioned, reduction of violence and attacks. There have been return of the living hostages, Israeli hostages, and return of a number of Palestinian hostages, as well as return of the remains on both sides. What hasn't happened is the increase of aid. And one of the things I want to talk about is what sort of aid is getting in now?
So there has been certainly an increase in the number of trucks getting into Gaza, which is, obviously not a great measure and never has been a good measure of aid and ability of aid groups to actually work in Gaza. But just as a really kind of not so great metric, it has increased. However, a lot of what is getting in is garbage kind of stuff. I mean, it's fizzy, sugary drinks, it's chocolate bars. It's also a lot of stuff that will not allow people to actually really recover. It's things that may keep people alive, but it's not going to allow any kind of significant recovery, even if it were allowed in at a real scale. That's the first part of it. I mean, the second part of it is that the stuff that's coming in generally is very expensive. The prices are completely beyond the means of most people in a normal situation, let alone people who have been living through 2 years of just utter destruction and deprivation. So in terms of what Israeli authorities are allowing in, it's certainly not meeting the needs, and what is getting in is incredibly expensive.
And that's not to even mention like what the Israeli authorities call the dual-use items that they do not allow in. Well, UNICEF has said that 2 million syringes that were about to go in to vaccinate children in Gaza were not allowed in. Israeli authorities denied that later. But what we know is that there's no massive allowing of aid to go in, despite what was said in the initial information about the plan. So, what are humanitarian actors saying and doing, both about the plan itself and about what they have seen now more than a month? We're nearly 6 weeks into the ceasefire.
I think the dual use good issue illustrates, I think, a lot of kind of the doublespeak that we're hearing about this, right? I mean, that the Israeli authorities are insisting that they are, in fact, allowing a massive scale up of aid. And then you have things like the syringes, which are not being allowed. And so there's, I think, a continuation of sort of this parallel reality almost that we've seen over the last couple of years, where you have aid agencies, Palestinians in Gaza, all the sort of principled actors saying one thing, and then you have the Israeli government saying something that's completely different, that bears no resemblance to reality at all. So, I've heard some cautious optimism from some humanitarian groups about this new American-led, military-led aid coordination mechanism. The mood on that has changed pretty dramatically over the last little while.
I mean, there have been an increased denunciation over the genocide by many aid agencies, from being entirely silent in the beginning into being more outspoken, some denouncing openly and so on. But then, since the ceasefire came into effect, almost everybody went silent. And on one level, it almost signals that everything's fine, we got what we wanted, and we're going on with business. My understanding from it, you're saying this is not the case. Why aren't they speaking out?
I think that there is, to a great extent, a sort of wait and see kind of attitude from at least from some organizations who are concerned about the dynamics with the US government, basically, and feel that being really outspoken may not be the most effective way to handle the situation, given that the US government and Trump is, the US government, it's Trump, is trying to push this peace plan. Is that the most effective strategy? We can debate whether or not that's the case. I mean, I think that over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of very reasonable criticism of parts of the UN and a lot of other humanitarian agencies for not calling this what it is. And also a strong argument to say that that's part of the reason why we are where we are right now, and that silence has to a certain extent enabled the impunity that allows Israeli forces to keep doing the stuff that they're doing.
I always struggle with, I now don't sit in a humanitarian organization with access and stuff on the ground. And I do respect that people have a calculus that is about the safety of their staff, ability to operate, and so on. But there is also a degree of fear and precaution that might not be justified. And what we're trying to do now is disentangle this exact question. What of it is reasonable that, a veteran humanitarian will tell you, we do that everywhere, and this is how humanitarianism gets access, and what of it is sort of having lost funding from the US and not much hope for anything better anyway, and yet still afraid of speaking out, unable to deliver basic mission, and using, this convoluted language of, we welcome the ceasefire that isn't really a ceasefire. We welcome the increase in aid, which is not, just to put it in context, I mentioned that Tom Fletcher was on the border with Gaza, and he was in a celebratory mode saying, 60 trucks entered today. Before the genocide, it was 500 trucks a day for normal situation when everything was working. So we're nowhere near fulfilling the basic needs. Is there a conversation, Riley, about, is that moral dilemma of access versus speaking out coming across anywhere, or is it just business as usual and this is where we are, this is what we can do?
I think the people who are facing that moral dilemma are the people who are actually on the ground kind of trying to deliver these services and trying to do their best to help people who, you're talking about UNRWA, for example, I mean, these are almost exclusively Palestinians who are working in their own communities, trying to help their own communities, who are hearing these kinds of messages coming from the higher ups. And I think those are the people who are right at the front of trying to deal with that moral dilemma that you're talking about. Certainly, I've heard a lot of that frustration from people. I think that's fair. I do think that also where you're hearing a lot of that frustration too is coming from the INGOs who have a completely different situation right now with respect to Gaza, just in the sense that because of the new laws imposed by the Israeli government with respect to registration of NGOs that basically prevent all of the principal actors from actually bringing in anything to Gaza, bringing in doctors, bringing in goods, they can't operate at all. And so when you have INGOs who are sitting in Gaza and unable to do the work that they would like to be doing, and then they're hearing this message, yeah, there's a pretty significant amount of dissonance there.
And you bring something important, because that's an experience. And I've been told many times we are being too negative, criticizing, people are trying their best. I do want to make a distinction, actually, between leaderships of organizations, particularly big INGOs, and people on the ground. I've heard entirely different refrains on what people think and expect and want. But a lot of the large organizations are extremely hierarchical, almost military-like, and things get decided in Geneva, New York, and Brussels, and so on. Is there a different desire or conversation between Palestinian-led humanitarian organizations and international ones? And in the international ones, do you feel that there is a dissonance between people who are actually day in, day out in Gaza, or for that matter, in Sudan or in anywhere else, and their headquarters?
I think certainly, yes, there is a difference. I think, honestly, particularly when it comes to Gaza and to Palestine, there's a very big difference when it comes to people who have just gotten there and people who've been there for a while. And I think one of the reasons that's significant is a lot of the aid workers and people, humanitarians who we've spoken to, have talked about how Israeli authorities use essentially the same playbook to delay aid, to prevent services from being delivered, from prevent. These are tactics that keep getting used over and over and over again. And so somebody who has come in just last month, and the Israeli authorities have engineered the situation using a denial of visas to humanitarians and using these onerous requirements for registration to create a situation in which a lot of the people who do this work at high levels are relatively new to the situation. For those people who are coming in and may not be familiar with that playbook, they're sitting across from somebody from, the Israeli COGAT coordination agency telling them that, yeah, it'll be fine. You can't bring your trucks up this road, but it's fine. We'll just use a different road, no worries. Or, you can't bring in your goods through this organization, no worries. We'll just do it another way. And then they go back and they talk to people who actually are living in Gaza, who have been here for a while or understand the context. And they can say, yeah, this is complete bullshit. They do this thing all the time. They did this thing last year. They did this thing 6 months ago. So experience is part of it. I think that's true. And I think that also that experience probably, cynicism is probably not quite the right word, but it creates, I think, maybe more realism on the part of some of the people who are doing this work, who kind of know what to expect and what to do. So that might be a driver of some of that difference you're talking about.
You mentioned the conditions, denial of visas, conditions that are being put on registration, and this has come up multiple times. In one of the occasions, the Israeli authorities put a set of conditions for registration, including announcing or declaring all staff, including Palestinian staff, which in itself causes a massive risk to Palestinian staff, who then can be accused of anything. At the time, if I remember it right, it was only Samaritan's Purse, an evangelical Christian organization in the US, that has accepted that condition. Do you know if those conditions are still there, and if any of the regular INGOs have succumbed to this, or whether it just went away?
They are not the only organization that has agreed to those conditions. What I can say is we are actively reporting on this right now, but basically without exception, all of the sort of principled humanitarian organizations have refused to sign on to those conditions because, as you point out, it would pose an enormous safety risk for their staff, not to mention contravening European data privacy laws, which is kind of an esoteric, but turns out to be quite an important thing here. So they are not the only organization that's agreed to it, but certainly the effect of that so far has been to basically make it impossible for most INGOs to be able to do the full extent of the work that they'd like to do in Gaza. And, basic things like bringing in new doctors, they can't do. I mean, one of the interesting things I guess that's worth pointing out is there was supposed to be a grace period on the application of some parts of that law, at least until the end of this year. In practice, Israeli authorities have not done that, and they are just enforcing the law, or at least de facto enforcing the law, just straight away.
Now that visas have been easy before the law,
No, and I mean, honestly, none of this should be particularly surprising, right? To anybody who's kind of been watching how this has been going over the last, not only over the last 2 years, but over the last number of decades.
The whole thing, as you say, for anyone who's familiar with it, and we're expecting that people who are working on this should be at least generally familiar or willing to read a book or something. There's not much new. I mean, 2014 was somewhat similar, except the scale now is massively bigger. But there's a playbook, and the playbook by the Israeli authorities is being followed to a T. None of it is new. Yet everybody, from politicians to humanitarian organizations, are acting as if, let's see how this unfolds. It's either too naive or too unsavory, to use the most polite word I can think. I mean, it's evil on the side of politicians. But for humanitarians, is anyone surprised? Are they just sailing the wave and waiting for someone else to call the emperor naked? What's happening here?
I think you bring up a really good point. That strategy has clearly proved not to work over the last couple of years. And prior to that, I mean, this idea of maybe at some point, magically the conditions will align, we'll have the right American president or the right alignment of the stars or something like that will allow us to kind of convince the Israeli authorities to do the thing that we want to do. And somebody who I've talked to who follows this quite closely has pointed out that to a great extent, a lot of Israeli policy is not really like one big thing. It's lots of little things that all try to advance the same goals, which, in this case is getting Palestinians out of Gaza, annexing the West Bank, and generally trying to create the conditions that would allow that sort of stuff to happen.
And I don't want to be facetious when we're talking about people's lives, but the language that is being employed, it is a dehumanizing language by the political establishment, but also a normalization of humanitarian language that pretends that the politics of occupation, apartheid, and genocide doesn't exist still. And just a few days ago, Heidi Mogstad, a Swedish academic, published a paper called Oppressive Language and Humanitarian Complicity, Reflections on Gaza and European Border Violence. And she identifies that erasing power and history and sort of talking about something as if it's its own phenomena without the power dynamics and the history of it, the political misrecognition of what is happening, calling Gaza a tragedy rather than a genocide, which a lot of humanitarians are guilty of. And finally, the diverting attention. We're talking now, if we're strong, we talk about not enough aid, but we don't talk about continuing occupation. We don't talk about the conditions that are calculated to continue to be miserable, particularly, as you mentioned now, the weather and the floods and the rain in Gaza with no shelter coming in. And we're chasing one policy at the time when there is an arsenal of hundreds of policies that are impossible to revert. What would be an alternative? If you were to tell humanitarian organizations, what you're doing is not working, they probably know, but at least it seems like a legitimate thing to do. What would you want them to do?
Oof. Gosh, I think that it has to be about principles fundamentally. I mean, I think that that is the key issue here. Think about what are we supposed to be doing? What is the purpose of this? And what is the moral obligation in a situation like this? And try to be governed by those principles. Ultimately, what I have heard from people over the past few years is one of the frustrations comes from when they see people abandoning principles in favor of sort of short-term political or logistical goals, with the idea that that may help to get a few trucks in today or tomorrow, but next month, next year, you're going to be back in the same situation again. So it has to be based on those fundamental principles and a basic morality. Now, I mean, that raises all kinds of other questions. And I think you start to get into this messy thing of, okay, well, maybe we have to make this compromise today in order to do this tomorrow. And I don't want to second guess people who are in situations where all of the options suck. There are no good choices to be made here. There are some less bad choices to be made, basically. So I recognize that it's extremely difficult to make that argument for principles in this kind of environment where like everything you do is potentially morally compromised. But I think you have to try it. That's what I've been hearing from people.
So I'm with you. My struggle is that we have sort of reduced principles effectively. And here I will do my regular rant about neutrality. Reduced principles into we have to be absolutely neutral no matter what. And I mean, when I say my regular rants, the ICRC hasn't spoken out about anything effectively. I've gone through their press statements for the past 2 years, and the word Israel doesn't come in, let alone anything. Obviously, when you call the Israeli hostages and the Palestinians, who are many thousands of them, incarcerated without a due process, prisoners, you're implying something that's already not neutral. But let that aside. The argument that the ICRC and similar organizations would make is, yes, we are acting on principles, as long as you agree with us on neutrality and that being the most important principle and nothing else. And to put the caveat, I mean, I've talked to the leadership of the ICRC and they will give you the whole spiel about neutrality. I've talked also to ICRC people on the ground in Gaza, and they do an incredible job. So I don't want to sort of paint the whole organization with one brush. People go out in Gaza and protect Palestinian Red Crescent volunteers as they are doing their jobs. They retrieve bodies, they save people. There's plenty of protection work that no one else can do. But there is a discord between what is done and what is said, and I'm not entirely sure that we have a framework. And I just want to finish. I want to go back to the local organizations. Do you have a sense of what Palestinian organizations or Palestinians who work in humanitarian or rights or similar civil society organizations would want to ask of us? And I know it's dodgy to ask anyone to speak on behalf of others, but as a journalist, I want to get your sense of what you've heard.
You know, fundamentally, what I've heard is that the leadership, the people who are in New York and Geneva, wherever, need to be listening to the people who are actually on the ground doing this work, the Palestinians who've been there for the last however many years, you know, through every kind of imaginable condition, trying to do the best that they can. They need to feel that their voices are being listened to and that their voices matter. Not only do they matter in the sense that people are listening to them and taking notes, but that there's actually some action that's coming from that, right? That what they're saying is being reflected in policy and in action. And in terms of what that actually looks like, you know, I'm not going to try to pretend to speak for people.
I think there is plenty to be said and plenty to be learned and listened to and learned as we go on seeing how things unfold. But for that, I really want to thank you, Riley. It's a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much for making the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Rethinking Humanitarianism. Our show is produced, edited, and mixed by Levi Sharp. Editorial oversight provided by Erwin Loy, Eric Reddy, and Freddie Buswell. If you have any questions or comments, you can email us at podcast@thenewhumanitarian.org. Please rate and subscribe to our show wherever you get your podcasts. Also, consider becoming a member of The New Humanitarian to help us continue reporting from the heart of crises. Go to www.thenewhumanitarian.org to find out more.